The air in Sector 4 always tasted of recycled rust and old copper, a metallic tang that coated the back of the throat and made the water from the wall spigots taste like blood. Down here, beneath the crushing weight of the irradiated world above, time was not measured in hours or minutes, but in the rhythmic thrumming of the ventilation shafts and the arrival of the rations. Cale sat on the edge of his cot, the thin, coarse wool scratching against his legs. He was a man whittled down by the subterranean years, his skin the color of parchment, his eyes hollowed out by the perpetual dimness of the amber emergency lights. He held the packet in his hands, a rectangular block wrapped in silver foil, cold to the touch. It was mealtime. The silence of the dormitory was broken only by the wet, smacking sounds of 300 other survivors unwrapping their sustenance and chewing. There was no joy in the eating. The ration blocks were a uniform gray, gelatinous, and dense, flavorless save for a vague, savory chemical aftertaste that lingered for hours. They kept them alive. They kept the sickness of the radiation at bay. That was the promise of the High Overseer, the disembodied voice that echoed through the vents every morning, preaching the gospel of preservation. Cale did not eat immediately. He was a man of rituals, a trait that had earned him the moniker the Archivist, among the few who still bothered to speak. While others tore into the foil with animal desperation, Cale smoothed the wrinkles of the wrapper. He wiped the condensation from the surface. He studied the black-stamped ink on the underside. Batch 492K prod, the 14th of October 2088. He frowned, his thumb tracing the numbers. The ink was fresh, stark against the silver. He pulled a small, battered notebook from beneath his mattress. It was a contraband item, a collection of scraps, bound together with wire, filled with his jagged handwriting. He turned the pages, past the tallies of days, past the sketches of the ventilation schematics, until he reached his log of the rations. He had been tracking the production codes for 6 months. At first, it was a way to keep his mind sharp, a mathematical exercise to stave off the rot of boredom. He looked for patterns in the batch numbers, trying to predict the rotation of stock. He assumed they were eating food preserved decades ago, before the sky burned. But the dates were wrong. The 14th of October, 2088, he whispered, the sound barely audible over the collective chewing of the dorm. The date didn't make sense as a manufacturing date for pre-war stock. The war had ended the world in the early 2000s. A date from the 80s would mean this food was nearly 50 years old. Possible, perhaps, for freeze-dried goods, but these were moist, hydrated. He looked across the aisle. Jaren, a hulking man who worked in the water reclamation plant, was licking the foil of his wrapper. Jaren caught Cale's stare and offered a grim, toothless smile. "Gonna eat that, Archivist?" Jaren grunted. "Or you gonna read it a bedtime story?" "Just checking the spoil date," Cale lied, peeling the foil back. The gray block glistened in the amber light. It smelled faintly of iron. "It don't spoil," Jaren laughed, a wet, rattling sound. "It's blessed. Everything down here is blessed." Cale took a bite. It tasted consistent, bland, heavy. But as he swallowed, he felt a cold stone of anxiety settle in his stomach. He opened his notebook again, shielding it with his body. He flipped to the back, where he kept a different list. Not of numbers, but of names. The rations were distributed based on work output. If you worked, you ate. If you were sick, you went to the infirmary. If you didn't return from the infirmary, your bunk was cleared, and a new survivor from the lower nurseries was moved up. 2 days ago, a woman named Rena had been taken to the infirmary. She had cut her leg on a rusted pipe in the hydroponics bay. Infection had set in fast, the black rot that the overseer warned of constantly. Cale remembered the medics coming for her. They wore the heavy, rubberized suits of the priesthood, their faces obscured by gas masks that looked like insect mandibles. Rena had been screaming not about the pain, but about the date. "It's not my time. The cycle isn't done," she had shrieked as they dragged her into the shadows of the corridor. Cale looked at the date in his notebook next to Rena's name. He had written down her birthday once. during a rare moment of vulnerability when the power had failed, and they sat in the pitch black waiting for the generators to kick back on. Rinna, October 14th. Kale stopped chewing. The gray mulch in his mouth suddenly felt like wet clay. He looked at the wrapper again. 10 to 14. It was a coincidence. It had to be. October 14th was a date that occurred every year. It meant nothing, but the seed of the thought had been planted, and in the fertile, paranoid soil of the bunker, it grew with terrifying speed. The weeks that followed were a slow descent into madness. Kale continued to eat. He had no choice. The hunger was a physical entity that clawed at his insides, but he ate with his eyes wide, watching, calculating. He began to hoard the wrappers. He smoothed them out and hid them inside the hollow metal leg of his cot. He built a database of foil and ink. The pattern was not immediate. It was subtle, buried in the bureaucracy of the codes. Not every packet corresponded to a person he knew. Most were strangers. But the correlation became undeniable when Old Man Holloway vanished. Holloway was the oldest resident of Sector 4. He claimed to remember the sun. He was frail, his mind wandering, but harmless. One night, the priesthood came. They didn't drag him. They guided him gently, whispering about ascension and the great contribution. Holloway had gone weeping with joy. 3 days later, the rations arrived on the conveyor belt. Kale received a block with the code 495H. Prod February 9th, 2029. Holloway's bunk number was 495. His birthday was February 9th. Kale sat in the mess hall, the noise of the facility roaring in his ears, like the ocean he had never seen. He looked at the block of food. It was slightly darker than usual, more fibrous. He looked up at the dais where the proctor stood. The proctors were the enforcers of the overseer, clad in pristine white robes over their armor. They did not eat with the general population. They watched. The proctor's eyes, hidden behind dark goggles, seemed to scan the room, looking for dissent, looking for weakness. Kale realized then that the facility was not a shelter, it was a farm. The realization did not bring panic. It brought a cold, crystalline clarity. The dark fantasy, the overseer, spun the sermons about unity, about the body of the community, about how they all sustained one another was literal. It was a transubstantiation of the most horrific kind. They were not just recycling water and air, they were recycling life. But there was a discrepancy. The physics of it didn't work. One human body could not feed 300 people for more than a meal. The rations were daily. The math suggested that the meat was being extended, multiplied, or grown. Kale needed to see the kitchen. Access to the lower levels was strictly forbidden. The elevators required biometric scans, and the stairwells were welded shut. But Kale was a maintenance worker. He knew the ventilation shafts. He knew the lungs of the bunker. He waited for the sleep cycle. The lights dimmed from amber to a deep bruised purple. The sound of snoring filled the dormitory, a chorus of exhausted souls. Kyle slipped from his bunk, moving like a ghost. He unscrewed the grate behind the latrines, a task he had been working on for nights, loosening the bolts a fraction of a turn at a time. He slid into the ductwork. It was tight, smelling of dust and ozone. He crawled on his belly, the metal biting into his elbows. He followed the heat. The kitchen would generate heat. He crawled for what felt like hours, descending through the labyrinthine guts of the silo. The air grew warmer, humid, and thick. The metallic smell faded, replaced by something earthy, sweet, and cloying. It smelled like a forest floor after rain, but sweeter the smell of overripe fruit and fermentation. He reached a grate that looked down into a vast, cavernous chamber. This was Sector 0, the heart of the facility. Kale peered through the slats, and his mind recoiled at the sight. He had expected stainless steel tables, grinders, saws, the industrial machinery of slaughter. He had expected a butcher shop. What he saw was a garden. The chamber was bathed in a pulsating bioluminescent green light. The floor was covered in a thick, carpet-like moss that seemed to breathe, and rising from the moss were the trees. But they were not trees of wood and bark. They were pillars of twisted, fleshy, organic matter, veined and pulsing. They grew in rows, stretching up toward the ceiling high above. And embedded in the trunks of these fleshy pillars were the missing. Cale clamped a hand over his mouth to stifle a scream. There was Rena, there was Holloway, there were dozens of others he recognized from the dormitory. They were not dead, they were integrated. Rena's body was fused into the stalk of a massive fungal growth. Her skin had turned a translucent green, and vines of the organic matter wove in and out of her flesh, entering her mouth, her ears, her chest. Her eyes were open, rolled back, seeing nothing, or perhaps seeing everything. She was comatose, dreaming in the grip of the organism. From the branches of these abominations hung large, bulbous pods. They pulsed with a rhythmic beat, pumping fluids from the hosts into the fruit. Robed figures, the wardens moved among the rows. They were not butchers, they were gardeners. They carried silver scythes. Cale watched as a warden approached the tree that held Holloway. The old man's face was serene, sunken into the bark flesh of the pillar. The warden reached up and sliced one of the heavy gray pods from the branch above Holloway's head. Thick, viscous fluid leaked from the cut stem. The warden placed the pod into a collection bin. This was the raw material. This was the ration. It wasn't simple cannibalism. It was parasitic agriculture. They were using the humans as batteries, as biological distinctiveness, to flavor the fungal mass that grew in the radiation. The human body acted as a filter, a synthesizer, processing the raw nutrients into something the colony could consume. The body of the community, Cale whispered, tears leaking from his eyes. Sustaining us all. He watched as a new group of orderlies wheeled a gurney into the chamber. On it lay a young man, barely 20, who had broken his arm in the loading docks yesterday. He was sedated. They lifted him toward an empty patch of the mossy wall, where the flesh vines reached out like eager fingers. The vines pierced his skin, not violently, but with a terrifying gentleness. The man sighed in his sleep as he was absorbed, his biology hijacked to grow the next month's harvest. Cale pulled back from the grate. He couldn't breathe. The sweet, rotting smell was cloying, coating his tongue. He had to get out. He had to tell. Who? Who would listen? Who would believe? And even if they did, what was the alternative? Starvation? The surface was a glass parking lot of radiation. There was no food up there. This abomination was the only reason they were alive. The horror wasn't just in the sight of the garden. The horror was the realization of his own complicity. He had eaten Rena, he had eaten Holloway, he had felt his strength return after the meal. He had enjoyed it. He crawled back. The journey up was harder, fighting gravity and the crushing weight of the truth. By the time he reached his dormitory, his muscles were trembling and he was covered in cold sweat. He screwed the grate back into place and collapsed onto his cot. He stared at the ceiling, the purple light mocking him. Morning came with the sound of the klaxon. Rise and rejoice. The overseer's voice boomed, smooth and synthetic. Another day of life is granted. Proceed to rations. The line formed, the shuffle of feet, the dead eyes of the survivors. Cale stood in line. He felt hollowed out, a husk. He reached the front. The proctor handed him a foil-wrapped block. Cale took it. He walked to his seat. He sat down. He looked at the wrapper. 502 M Prod, November 30th, 2029-2. He froze. Unit 502, that was his bunk number. November 30th, that was today. The blood drained from his face. He looked up, scanning the room. The proctor on the dais was not looking at the crowd. He was looking directly at Cale. The dark goggles reflected the amber light, twin suns in a void. The proctor raised a gloved hand and tapped his wrist, then pointed a finger at KL. It wasn't a production date. It wasn't an intake date. It was an expiration date. The label was a summons. KL looked down at the block in his hand. It was his own replacement. He was holding the caloric value that would fill the gap he was about to leave. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in his chest. He stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the concrete floor. Heads turned. The chewing stopped. "No," Cale whispered. Two proctors at the doors stepped forward, their movements synchronized. They didn't draw weapons. They didn't need to. They pulled batons from their belts, the tips crackling with electricity. "Resident 502, the voice of the proctor amplified through the room. "You have been selected. Your contribution is required." "I won't go," Cale shouted, backing away. I saw the garden. I know what you do." The room murmured. The survivors looked at him with a mix of fear and confusion, but there was no outrage. They were too tired, too hungry. "He is delirious," the proctor stated calmly. "Radiation sickness has touched his mind. He requires the infirmary." "It's not an infirmary," Cale screamed, backing into the table behind him. "It's a farm. We are the soil. They plant us, and we grow this filth." He threw the ration block at the proctor. It landed with a wet thud on the floor. "I saw Rena. I saw Holloway. They're alive down there, turned into trees." Silence stretched tight across the mess hall. For a second, Ale thought he saw a spark of recognition in Jaren's eyes, a flicker of doubt. But then Jaren looked at the ration block on the floor. He looked at the proctors moving in. He looked at his own half-finished meal. Jaren stood up. Cale felt a surge of hope. "Sit down, Archivist," Jaren said heavily. "Don't ruin it for the rest of us." Cale stared at him. The betrayal was absolute. It wasn't that they didn't believe him. Somewhere, deep down in the lizard brain of every survivor, they knew. They knew why the food tasted like copper. They knew why the missing never wrote back. But the hunger was stronger than the morality. The survival instinct had cannibalized their souls long before they ate the flesh. The proctors were on him. Kael fought, swinging his fists, but he was weak from years of malnutrition. A baton struck his shoulder, sending a jolt of liquid fire through his nerves. His knees buckled. They dragged him toward the double doors. "You can't do this," Cale wept, his heels skidding on the concrete. "I am a human being." "You are a vessel," the proctor whispered in his ear as they hauled him into the corridor. "And your vessel is full. It is time to pour it out." The door slammed shut, cutting off the light of the mess hall. The darkness of the corridor swallowed him. They didn't take him to the elevator. They took him to the freight lift. As the lift descended, rattling into the depths, the smell hit him again. The sweet, cloying scent of the garden. Cale stopped fighting. He slumped against the wire mesh of the cage. He thought of the wrapper in his pocket. The date. Today. The lift opened. The green light washed over him. The humidity clung to his skin. He saw the rows of breathing pillars. He saw the empty patch of moss prepared for him, the vines writhing in anticipation. A warden approached, holding a syringe. "Do not fear," the warden said, a voice distorted by the mask. "There is no pain, only unity. You will feed the children of the atom. You will be eternal." Kael looked at the empty space on the wall. He realized with a terrifying finality that he wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of not dying. He was afraid of becoming part of the walls, dreaming forever in the green dark, feeling his essence drained, drop by drop, to wrap in silver foil. The needle pierced his neck. The world began to swim. The green light blurred into a beautiful, terrible aurora. "Eat up," Cale mumbled, his tongue thick and numb, as they lifted him onto the moss. "Eat up," as the vines gently pierced his skin, initiating the graft. Cale's last conscious thought was not of escape, nor of rebellion. It was a detached, Archivist's observation. He wondered who would get his ration next week. He hoped they would check the date.